Hey, what's up everybody? It's Crawl. Welcome back to another Terraria tier list. This time, we're doing every ranged weapon in the game, including consumables. But this time, we have background footage. Thank you, me, for making this video more watchable. Alright, but let's go ahead and get straight into it. First off, we're going to start with bows. Now, the first bows we got are all of the wooden bows. And I think it's safe to say, the wooden bows are a great starter weapon for something like bows only. You can actually start with something, but I also think there's no real reason to go straight for a wooden bow besides protection when you could just go for the ore bows. So for that reason, we're going to put them in F tier. Now, the ore bows are a significant upgrade to the wooden bows. So slightly, you can get them a little bit harder, but just as easily, really, if you think about it. And for that reason, I'm going to put all of them in F tier, except for the gold and platinum bows, which I will move into C tier just for the purpose of being the best of the ores, the highest damage, the highest fire rate, blah, blah, blah. Next up, we have the demon and the Tindin bow, both of which, they kind of have the two different sides. One of them shoots a lot faster but has slightly less damage, and one of them shoots slower but hits a lot harder. I think these two are both, they're decent, they're nice upgrades. I'm going to put them in C tier alongside the gold and platinum bows, however, just because they don't give you much of a boost in terms of pure output as some of these other bows will. Like the Blood Rain bow. The Blood Rain bow is a wonderful bow. First time I used it was testing it out in my arena back here. Awesome bow. You get it from fishing during a blood moon, which is the worst thing ever, like in the world. But it's basically a pre-hard mode dataless storm bow. And it can't pierce or anything because it uses the Blood Rain, but I think I really like this weapon a lot, especially for some of these early pre-hard mode bosses like Skeletron it could be useful for. You can get it right out the gate. It's a good weapon. Blood Rain bow, B tier. Next up, we have the Molten Fury. Now this bow, I love. It's one of my favorite bows in the game. It doesn't do a whole lot. It'll turn your wooden arrows into fire arrows, which is whatever. But when you combine it just with the pure best arrows in the game, like the Hellfire, Jester, Unholy, this thing's a beast. It does so much damage. This thing with Hellfire arrows against any of pre-hard mode's bosses shreds. It destroys, and I think just for that, getting it before Skeletron even, S tier bow. Next up, we have the Bee's Knees, and some people might also put this one in S tier, but for me, I think I have to leave it just in the A tier for the sole fact that while it is awesome and it does shred the Wall of Flesh, especially if you have the Hive Pack, it's just, I don't know, there's something about it that makes it's harder to get than the Molten Fury in a way. Like the Queen Bee's not too difficult to defeat, but Molten Fury, you mine some ore, you get the best bow in pre-hard mode. Bee's Knees, you gotta beat a boss, maybe you don't get it, maybe it takes forever to drop, old boss drops ordeals, but it's a solid A tier, borderline S tier. You can put it wherever you want. And the Hellwing bow. I think I actually rarely ever used the Hellwing bow up until I was testing out in my background footage and realized this thing kind of melts the Wall of Flesh. It does a lot of damage. And yeah, that's really all I gotta say. It's like the last bow that you can get in pre-hard mode. That I don't think it's as good as the Molten Fury, just for the sole fact that you need to get the Shadow Keys, and sometimes Shadow Keys are the worst. So for that, I'm going to put it in A tier with the Bee's Knees. This is the final pre-hard mode tier list. Next up, we have the hard mode bows. First off, Pearlwood bow. Put that straight into F tier. Next, the one and only dataless storm bow. As we all know, this thing has been nerfed into the ground and is still extraordinarily broken. No matter what they do, this bow is going to be crazy good. That's why we have to easily put it in S tier. This thing can carry you through all of the game, and with bows being the most breakable of the entire weapon classes in my opinion, this thing is the key to all of that, and I love it for it. S tier bow 100%. Now the ice bow, I don't know how people are going to think about this one. I think this bow sucks really bad. It's just a bow. It doesn't do anything special. Its special arrows suck. You can't get any special arrows with it, and I don't know, Frostburn isn't that good. I mean, it is good, but for this, you just get the dataless storm bow. It's so much better. Almost similarly, the Shadow Flame bow, but I actually really like what this does a lot more. Just a C tier, but just a little bit better than the ice bow in my opinion. But the Marrow, in a very similar way to the ice bow, is just a bow that you can't use special arrows with. It sucks. I hate the Marrow so much. It's one of my least favorite bows in the entire game. The Pulse bow, bought from the Traveling Merchant. I don't like this one either. I have to put it in C tier. I know some people might disagree with that. There's no use case for this when the dataless storm bow exists. The dataless storm bow is crazy. Every bow could be F and the dataless storm bow could be S. That's just how it is. Pulse bow, C tier. I will take no arguments. The Phantom Phoenix, a drop from one of the Old One's Army bosses. I'm gonna put this one in B tier, I think. I really like, you can still use like special arrows with it, and it launches this piercing phoenix that does a ton of damage, and I honestly, against groups of enemies, this bow is amazing. It's a really good bow, obviously not as good as some of these other ones, but I think for hard mode, B tier, you know, nice piercing for some of these events. Nice, it's good, B. Next up, the arguably best bow in the game, the Tsunami. Dropped from old Duke Fishron himself. You can take the Daedalus Stormbow and just wipe them down with some Ichor arrows or any arrows you want and get the Tsunami early before even the mech bosses, and you can just shred through the rest of the game, even to the Moonlord, finishing out the entire thing. You could honestly use 4 bows the entire run and only those, and you could beat the entire game. That's how crazy bows are. Especially these top tier bows are just so much higher quality than these lower tier bows. Even the difference between S to A is insane. Next up, we have the Aerial Bane, which is I'm going to put in the A tier here. A drop from Betsy from the Old One's Army, which is one of the reasons it's not great, but I really like its effect. It does this like wide sweeping arc of fire, whatever. It's a nice bow. It does a lot of damage. I just don't think it's as good as something like the Tsunami or the Daedalus Stormbow at all. So I'm going to put it in A tier for the point you get in the game and just how the Tsunami is so much better. Next up, the Empress of Light's bow, the Eventide. I really like this bow a lot, but it is obviously not as good as the Tsunami, and I don't know if that's lack of experience using it because it's an Empress of Light weapon or what, but I'm going to put it into the A tier. It's a really good bow, it's just not that good. And finally, the Phantasm. Of course, gotta put it in S tier. It is tied with the Tsunami for me for best bow in the game. I don't know which one's better. I used the Phantasm in my bow's only playthrough to defeat the Moonlord, but I could have used the Tsunami just as easily, I think. So S tier bow, that's about it. Alright, next we have the guns, starting with the pre-hard mode guns, the Flare Gun. Now the Flare Gun is bad, F tier. Does 1 damage per tick, and the fire does 1 damage per tick. It's just bad. It's a bad gun. It's not supposed to be used as a weapon, but it's here, so F tier. Next we have the Flintlock Pistol, also an F tier. I don't know why this gun exists. It is worse than the Undertaker, it is worse than the Revolver, and by the time you can buy it, you're most likely gonna have the Musket or the Undertaker anyway. It's a straight up downgrade. Next, the Revolver, sold from the Traveling Merchant. It is technically a DPS upgrade to the Undertaker, but you need to get it from the Traveling Merchant, which as we all know means it is worthless. So C tier for the Revolver. The Undertaker, a B tier weapon. It is just a nice mid damage revolver, most likely the first gun you can get. You can get it as soon as you get bombs in the game to give you a nice early weapon, and you know, it's good. It's all around good. The handgun, I'm gonna put in C tier. Now, the handgun is good, it's much better than the Undertaker, but it only belongs in C tier because you're never going to use this thing. As soon as you get this thing out of the dungeon, you're upgrading it to the Phoenix Blaster, which is an A tier weapon. I almost debated putting it in S just for how good it is in pre-hard mode. But I think truly there's only really one S tier pre-hard mode gun, and it is not any of these. The A tier for the Phoenix Blaster is its home, and it is probably the best gun you're gonna get in pre-hard mode without taking any extra steps for weird ammo types, blah blah blah. It's a great gun. You'll see later what I mean by the weird ammo types. Let's move on to shotguns. We got the Boomstick. I'm gonna put it in B tier. You can go straight to the dungeon, you can get it out of a chest, and boom, you have a shotgun. Does more damage than the Undertaker, and it is pretty solid. You can get you through a lot of enemies. You can get some meteorite bullets soon after, and you can get through crowds of enemies. It's nice. Especially if you have Crimson, you get Brain of Cthulhu in the world, you can beat it up with the Boomstick, and it's great. Next, we have the Quad Barrel Shotgun. I'm going to put this up into A tier alongside the Phoenix Blaster. It's just good, you know, not much to say about it. It's just a straight upgrade to the Boomstick, really. It does a ton of damage. You can use it against the Wall of Flesh. You can use it against some of these easier bosses to get some farming in. It's all around a good A tier weapon. Moving on to like rifles, we got the Red Rider, straight from Christmas Presents, I believe. Red Rider sucks. It's bad. I hate this gun. It legitimately just sucks. Moving on. Next, we have the Musket. Now, unlike the Undertaker, this is its corruption counterpart. It fires incredibly slow, but has a ton of damage. But its slow fire rate actually ends up in less DPS total than the Undertaker, I'm pretty sure. This thing's going into C tier. I hate this thing. If I'm playing ranged, I barely ever want to go corruption just because the Musket is so bad. And next we have the Mini Shark. Now, I don't know if this is a hot take or not. Mini Shark, B tier weapon. I don't like it. I don't like it for really anything. I barely even like it to take on Skeletron, but I would use it because it's like the only really option you have outside of like the shotguns or something. It's just okay. You know, it's not as good as it once was back when we were really limited on weapons. The Phoenix Blaster is such a better choice compared to the Mini Shark if you're going to take it to the Wall of Flesh fight. Its damage is so low and its fire rate is not quick enough to make that damage usable. B tier for the Mini Shark. Now we got some of the other guns. Get the blowpipe, F tier weapon. You know, you can use seeds, but it's, you know, it's like that when you get in a wooden chest, and you're like, okay, I can use this for about 5 seconds before I go and get an actual gun. Next, we have blowgun. I'm gonna put this one into C tier just for the fact it's basically the same as the blowpipe, does more damage, but it can shoot darts. But the only real darts available in pre-hard mode are the poison dart, and it's not very good. So blowgun's going into C tier. It's hard to use as well. The snowball cannon also goes into the C tier. It's like a gimmick. You use snowballs. You can get it from an ice chest really early and maybe take out the Eye of Cthulhu with it, and that's about it, in my opinion. It's about all it has use for. On the other end though, the sand gun, I'm actually going to move into B tier. Now, with the one downside of needing to use sand and it covering your world with sand blocks, this thing's damage is kind of crazy actually. I think this thing is a sleeper gun. You can use this for so many bosses. I love it. Sand gun, B tier. And now, for the weapon you guys might not all be expecting, some of you might think it's a launcher, but I'm going by the wiki standards here, which means it's a gun. So we're looking at the Star Cannon. The Star Cannon is a gun that shoots fallen stars, and this thing obliterates bosses. These fallen stars pierce like pretty infinitely, I think, pretty much infinite. You can destroy the Wall of Flesh with it, you can destroy the Brand of Cthulhu with it, you can destroy the Eater of Worlds with it, doesn't matter. Star Cannon is insanely good, and if you haven't given this a shot in a ranged playthrough, use it. It's amazing. And finally, we got the Pneumatic Horn, dropped from Deerclops. It's, I'm gonna put it in B tier. I think it's a very good weapon, but overall, the randomness of it kind of moves it down in my slots a little bit. You know, sometimes you could hit like 12 damage, and sometimes you could hit 40 damage, which is really good for pre-hard mode, but it just, that randomness doesn't sit right with me, and it's definitely not as good as the 3 above it. B tier for the Pneumatic Horn. Moving into hard mode, we have the Uzi. I'm gonna put this into A tier. You can get it as soon as you go into hard mode off of Angry Trappers, and I really like the Uzi. It's just a better mini shark. It's like a good mini shark, pretty much. Uzi, A tier, not much to say about it. Shoots real quick. The dart rifle and the dart pistol, I'm putting both of these into F tier. They are borderline unusable in my opinion. I think these things suck, and I think darts need a better weapon. They both are so random in how they shoot, and they're bad, and I don't know. Just while testing these out, I literally did not have a single fun time using them. F tier weapons. Next, we have the Venus Magnum. I'm putting this thing straight into A tier, almost S tier. I used it to take out all of the pillars up until I could get the Vortex Beater, the final pistol. Honestly, put it in S tier if you want. I would agree with that just as much as I do in A tier. It is just an incredibly fast pistol that does a ton of damage. Great weapon, A tier. And the Vortex Beater I'm putting into SMGs and pistols. It's an S tier weapon. It's the best gun in the game for the pre-end game. I love it. I love the Vortex Beater. It's so fun to use. It is so powerful. S tier weapon, not much to say. Next, we have the shotgun. I think the shotgun is F tier. It's similar kind of vein to the handgun, except for the handgun, while it is usable for like at least a little bit if you wanted to, the shotgun is bad. The shotgun is straight up bad. You'd never want to use this thing because you can just make the Onyx Blaster, which is another S tier weapon for guns. The Onyx Blaster is so good. You can see people destroy Duke Fishron with this thing. You can see people destroy every single mech boss with this thing. It is just amazing. The Onyx Blaster is the only good thing about the shotgun. S tier weapon. Next up, the tactical shotgun. I'm moving this into F tier as well. It's just a shotgun that shoots fast and does more damage. I hate it. The weapons you can get at this point in the game, post-playing Terra, are way better, including the Venus Magnum up in A tier. Don't use this thing, it's not good. And finally for shotguns, we have the Xenopopper. I'm gonna put this thing straight into B tier. It's post-Golem from the Martian Madness event. And it's good, you know, it shoots out these little bubbles that can hit enemies and then they pop into bullets. I think overall it's a middle-of-the-road weapon. I'm gonna just put it into B tier just because I think there are better options and there are worse options. B tier. Alright, moving on, we have the Clockwork Assault Rifle. Now this weapon you get from the Wall of Flesh. It's one of the Wall of Flesh's first hard mode weapons, and it's just okay. I don't like it. I think you can get something like the shotgun and then the Onyx Blaster so much easier than just hoping you get this. And even when you do get this, it's not that good. You're just going to use it until you can get one of those. I'm going to put it into the C tier. And then we have the Mega Shark. The Mega Shark, I'm going to put on the same level as the Mini Shark here. I'm putting it into B. I just don't like it that much. I don't know, it's annoying to get. You got to get the illegal gun parts, and then you need to have a mech boss defeated, and I just don't think it's that good. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but the Mega Shark is just not that fantastic. B tier weapon in my opinion. Next we got the Gatligator. I'm gonna put this thing straight into the F tier. The Gatligator sucks. Gotta get it from the Traveling Merchant. It is a worse Mega Shark. That's it. That's all I gotta say. Gatligator, F tier. Now the chain gun you can get from the Santa Mark 1s or the Santank 1s. It's just a better Gatligator. It's just a better Mega Shark. I'm gonna put it in the same tier as the Mega Shark, B, because at the point you're getting this post Plantera, you can just use the Venus Magnum, or just defeat Golem with it as well and go straight for the pillars and get the Vortex Beater. It's weirdly placed in the game, and I don't think it's worth it at that point, B tier. Next, we have the sniper rifle straight from the post-Plantera dungeon, and I think this thing blows. This thing sucks so bad. It's so bad. Oh man, does so much damage, but you can only shoot once a Sentry with it. It's so bad. Don't use this thing, F tier. The Candy Corn rifle, however, Candy Corn, C tier. It's okay. Shoots candy corn. Finally, for these rifles, we have the SDMG, the Space Dolphin Machine Gun. I'm putting this thing straight into S tier. It is nuts how good this thing is. It's a post-Moonlord weapon, however, so you can drop it down for that if you want. But based on pure power and pure coolness of its design, S tier weapon for me. Love it. Moving into the other category, we have the Coin Gun. The Coin Gun, I really like. With platinum coins, you can get tons of easily in the vanilla Terraria game. It does a ton of damage. I have to put it straight into A tier just for the fact of both its novelty and how much damage it actually does. It's an A tier weapon for me. I love it. Next up, we have the Star Cannon's upgrade, the Superstar Shooter, and just like its little brother, it is so good. This thing can destroy the Destroyer. If you're having a tough time with the Destroyer, you take out one of the other mech bosses and then you just make this thing. Oh, it's crazy good. Get this thing if you're ever having trouble with the Destroyer, or you can use the next weapon as well, the Flamethrower. The Flamethrower is a fantastic option, specifically for bosses like the Destroyer and big groups of enemies. The Flamethrower uses gel to shoot, but it shoots out this big streak of fire that you can just get the perfect angle on the Destroyer and melt away its health bar. If you're ever having trouble with the Destroyer, use this thing, I promise you. And finally, we have the Elf Melter, the Flamethrower's upgrade. I'm going to put this one into C tier, unlike the Flamethrower, just because it's so late into the game when you get this thing. And while it is infinitely better than the Flamethrower, you're not going to use it on any bosses or any events at this point in the game. C tier weapon, unfortunately. I love it though. This is the final gun tier list. Look at it. Next up, we have repeaters, hard mode only weapons. Please give us hard mode repeaters, Terraria. I'm begging you. I mean, you might consider these bows, and I'm sure you should as well, as the game is probably intended for you to, but we're going to go and look at them just based off of this. First, let's look at the ore repeaters. The Cobalt and Palladium, I'm putting them together as they are both the first tier of hard mode ores, both in F tier. Next up, we got Mithril and Orichalcum, F tier. Why are you making anything out of Mithril or Orichalcum, including armor? And finally, we have the Adamantite and Titanium repeaters going into the B tier because they're the only really usable repeaters out of these hard mode ore tiers, and the only ones you will really be using for any bosses once you get into hard mode, until you take out one of the mech bosses and you get the Hallowed repeater, which I'm going to put in an even space in B tier. They all do the same thing. Repeaters need a desperate overhaul, I think. But the Hallowed repeater is just a damage upgrade to the Titanium and Adamantite repeaters. But the next one you get, the Chlorophyte Shotbow, shoots 3, maybe more arrows at a time every time you shoot it. I love this thing. It's an A tier weapon. I used to main this thing back in 1.2.4 to take on Duke Fishron. So a little bit of nostalgia here, but A tier for me. Until you get to the Stake Launcher, which I'm going to put in A tier as well. The Stake Launcher is a Pumpkin Moon drop, and it shoots out stakes, a special ammo type, of course, which kind of sucks a little bit, but this thing shreds. This thing's awesome. This is the first time I used it, was testing these out, and I tested on so much stuff, and the TPS on this thing is crazy. I love it, and I think you should give it a shot next time you play, see if you like it. That wraps up repeaters. Here's the final tier list. And then we move into launchers, another hard mode only thing if you don't count the star launchers and star cannons and such. First up, we got the grenade launcher starting from Plantera here. I gotta put it in C tier. It's just, you get it so late in the game, Plantera. It's good, but it's only really good against enemies because it's an explosive and it's so goddamn slow. But C tier weapon, that's all I really gotta say about it. Same goes for the proximity launcher. I'm also putting it into the C tier. It's just a bigger grenade launcher. It does more damage. I don't know. It's not that good either. First real difference here though is the rocket launcher. I'm gonna put into the B tier for its far higher damage, and it's just like kind of better usage here. You can just get so much more damage, you get more velocity with it. It's crazy. The rocket launcher is good. It's a B tier weapon. None of the launchers are my favorite. Next we got the nail gun, F tier. You get this in the solar clips from nail heads or pin heads or whatever. It's bad. You shoot the nails and they explode over time, and I hate this weapon, F tier. Next up, straight from the Pumpkin Moon, we got the Jack-o'-lantern launcher, the Jack-o'-launcher. This thing is C tier, you know, shoots out these bouncing jack-o'-lanterns that explode into these huge explosions, and I think that's awesome, but I think the Pumpkin Moon post-Plantera, like all of these weapons kind of are, I don't like it at all. Like, even against like groups of enemies, I don't think it's that good. There are way better weapons you can use, like the Frost Moon counterpart, the Snowman Cannon. Now the snowman cannon is crazy good. I love this thing so much. Ah, it's awesome. It shoots out like a homing snowman. It's cool. The rockets you can use with it make it super powerful. It's crazy. Go use the snowman cannon if you have never done it before. It's awesome to use. Now next up might be a controversial placement, but I'm gonna put the Stinger into the B tier. A golem drop weapon. It shoots out these stinger bolts and it does like these little explosions, and I don't know, I like this weapon. I don't know what about it I like so much, but it's always had a nice place with me. Nice middle of the road, great weapon to use. I've used it in ranged playthroughs before. B tier weapon for sure. Next up we have the Electrosphere launcher coming straight out of the Martian Madness event. This thing is a C tier, borderline F tier, but in bosses where you can't actually get close to it because it has such a short range, that's its main downside. This thing shreds. This thing does a ton of damage. So just for that, I'm going to put it into the C tier. It's not as bad as the nail gun in the slightest. Getting close to wrapping up here, we have the Celebration. I'm going to put it straight into B tier. Buy it from the Party Girl. It shoots out these fireworks. It does a big area damage. It's all around decent weapon. I don't have much to say about it, just a B tier. The fireworks are cool. And then, of course, we have the Celebration Mark II, a Moonlord drop, replacing the old Celebration S tier weapon. This thing's crazy. It shoots out so many rockets and explosions and blasts. It's so cool. It's fun to watch as well. If you have never seen it used, it's an awesome weapon. S tier for me. And that wraps up launchers. Here's the final tier list. All right, next up we have some of the other weapons in Terraria. Let's start off with the Ale Tosser. This thing is garbage. God, this thing sucks so bad. F tier, F tier, F tier, F tier. This thing sucks. But it's an NPC drop weapon though, so that's what can you expect. But I do expect more. There's another NPC drop weapon. The paintball gun is actually pretty usable. You know, it's not super usable, but you can use it. I'm going to put it into the C tier here because you can at least take out one boss with it, and that's the Eye of Cthulhu. So, shout out to the fucking paintball gun. Next, we have the Harpoon. Dropped from the Goblin Army. Enemy there. I hate this thing. I really do. I have to give it an F tier. It's one of my least favorite weapons in the entire game. You miss your shot with it, and you're vulnerable for the next 18 years. You're beaten down, beaten away, and killed before you can even get your next shot off. F tier weapon. Fuck the Harpoon. Moving on to the hard mode other weapons, we have the Piranha Gun. The Piranha Gun's decent, you know? You can get up close, you can latch onto the enemy, and then you just focus all your attention on dodging while your piranhas eat away at that enemy until it dies. I mean, what can you complain about? It's just that it's kind of hard to hit all your piranhas with. That's about it. B tier weapon. Next, we have the Toxic Carp, and you know, it shoots out bubbles. Those bubbles don't do a lot of damage. It's a fishing weapon, so of course it's not going to be great. But when you look at things like the Crystal Serpent, which are so good and are also hard mode fishing things you can get right out the gate, Toxic Carp sucks so bad. C tier weapon, never use this thing. And finally, we have the Consumables. I decided to throw in Consumables here just for a little bit of extra. They do range damage after all. So let's go ahead and go into it. First off, we have the Shuriken. I'm putting the Shuriken into C tier. It's just good. You know, it's okay. It pierces, it does very little damage, but you can at least use it to get through some of these bosses in the game if you're really skilled enough. So, C tier weapon. The Star Anise, I'm also going to throw into the C tier. It's basically just an upgraded shuriken from like presents and like the Christmas time event. So, you know, it's whatever. Then we have the Spiky Balls, F tier, dropped from every enemy in the Goblin Army. They suck. They suck so bad that you can barely throw them anywhere. They fall straight to the ground and they do damage as you step over them. They suck so bad. F tier. Next, we have the Throwing Knife. I'm going to put it into C tier as well because it's basically the same thing as the Shuriken. I don't really have much to say different about it. It's just the Shuriken, but it looks different. C tier. We also have the Poison Knife, which I'm going to put into B tier. It is very similar. It does pretty much the same thing as a Throwing Knife, but it does poison the enemy. And poison is good. So it's just better, so B tier. And then we have the Bone Throwing Knives. A tier throwing consumable here. Pierces enemies, does a decent chunk of damage. You can't really complain about it at all. It's easy to get. You just get it from fossils. Done. A tier. Moving on. Frost Daggerfish, fish from the ice biome. I think B tier. They do kind of similar damage to the bone throwing knives, but they don't pierce as many enemies, and you have to fish to get them, and they're not the most common thing to get in the world either. B tier just for how hard they are to get and just being a little bit worse than the bone throwing knives. Then we have javelins. Javelins I'm putting into F tier. You gotta get them from rare enemies in a rare biome that I rarely ever see. So F tier, fuck javelins, they suck. However, bone javelins, B tier. They stick into the enemy and then they deal damage over time. They're cool. You can make them with fossils. B tier weapon. Moving on to some explosives, we have the grenades. I'm gonna move the grenade into F tier. Same with the sticky, bouncy, and happy grenade. I think all of the grenades are pretty bad. You can't really throw them very far. They're good against basic enemies, but when you're looking at bosses and stuff, they're borderline unusable, so they're an F tier for me. The one S tier consumable in the game, and I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, is also a grenade. The bee nades, dropped from the queen bee. These things are nuts. Combine it with the hive pack and your bees go crazy. You just chuck them like mad, and it'll destroy the wall of flesh, it'll destroy the ivy, it'll destroy any pre-hard mode boss in your way. Bee nades are nuts. S tier for sure. And then we have Molotov cocktails to finish off the explosives. I'm gonna put them in B tier as well. They're kind of slow, but they do a ton of damage and they do burn damage over time. So overall, just pretty decent. Not crazy, not B-nade level, but not shuriken level. So I'll put it in the B tier. Maybe A if you're feeling good. And then moving on to some of the weird consumables we have. We got snowballs, mainly used for the snowman cannon as a projectile, but you can also just throw them and have fun little snowball fights with your friends. So for that alone, S tier. But for every other way in combat, F. For sure, this thing sucks, does no damage, you can barely throw them very far, F tier. Then we have rotten eggs. Rotten eggs are also an F tier weapon, except for these, they have a special little gimmick in that you can kill NPCs with it to get their drops. And that's about it. You use them to kill NPCs if you want to, and then you're done. You never use them again, they suck in combat as well. And then we have bones dropped from skeletons from the dungeon. I'm going to put into C tier. Very similar to these shurikens and throwing knives and the frost daggerfish and such. I just think, like, you know, at the point you're fighting Skeletron, you probably got a surplus of B-nades if you're doing consumables. And, you know, you're not going to use those over anything else, and you're not even going to use these over the bone throwing knives. C tier for me. And that wraps up the consumables tier list. Here it is. And that also wraps up the entire ranged weapons tier list. This time, we have summon weapons, going all the way from all the minions, to whips, to sentries, even to some of the few armor bonuses in the game. Let's go ahead and get straight into it with the pre-hard mode minions. First up, we've got Abigail's Flower. Abigail's Flower can be obtained as soon as you start the game, and it gets a straight damage buff into hard mode, letting her deal lots of good damage. Very solid overall. I'm going to put Abigail's Flower into A tier. Next, we have the Finch Staff, which can be obtained from the start of the game as well, as long as you get lucky enough to get it in a Living Wood tree. However, needing that does lower it a little bit, but you can also throw a Living Wood wand into the Shimmer to obtain it, so it's not a big deal. It does very little damage, however, but it pierces through enemies and they fly, which is a little bit of a bonus. Really great for either world evil boss, but especially the brain because they do just enough knockback to keep them from touching you. We're going to put the Finch Staff into C tier. The Flink Staff. Now the Flink Staff is basically an upgrade to the Finch Staff. Super easy to obtain early game, and although they don't fly, they do pretty much stick to enemies, they just bounce all over them. Higher damage in the Finch and shred both of the world bosses with ease. Decent, but not the greatest at groups of enemies, so we're going to put it into B tier. The Slime Staff, one of the hardest summons to obtain in the game naturally. You really have to spend a lot of time farming for this item just for it to be outclassed by the Flink Staff in every single way. Almost no purpose, but does have the potential to perform a little bit better against the Eater of Worlds. We're going to put it in F tier though. Next, we have the Vampire Frog Staff. This one is somewhat annoying to obtain, being dropped by Blood Moon fishing enemies. It is a very powerful weapon though. It does have a big downside in that flying enemies and bosses make this summon very, very mediocre. However, against stuff like the Eater of Worlds and big groups of enemies, this staff will shred. We're going to put it into the B tier. Next, we have the Hornet Staff. It's actually pretty decent fire rate, and they deal poison damage, which is very good. But they are obtained after defeating the Queen Bee, and by that point, a lot of people probably have something like the Imp Staff, which I would consider to be a better weapon due to higher damage and piercing shots. We're going to put it into C tier just because you can get the Imp Staff at about the same time, and it is better. Speaking of, let's go to the Imp Staff. The Imp Staff is definitely the best staff available in pre-hard mode. It has infinite piercing, as well as very high damage, making them perfect for finishing off the Wall of Flesh and any other boss in pre-hard mode that you might need to take out. And you only have to beat the evil bosses to get it, being crafted from Hellstone, so very great summon weapon and the one you're going to use to progress into hard mode for the most part. And that wraps it up for the pre-hard mode minions, at least until 1.4.5 comes out, so let's go ahead and get straight into those. We have the Spider Staff up first. The Spider Staff is the first hard mode staff you'll be able to acquire pretty much, easily obtained for summoners being craftable just from Spider Fangs, as well as its armor giving you a nice buff. They do a ton of damage, and their only real downside is that flying enemies can sometimes be a problem, but if you get them to attach to the enemy, it will be fine. This is also eliminated by putting walls on the back of your arena, but that is of course not always viable. We're going to put the Spider Staff into B tier. The Sanguine Staff. Now this is undoubtedly one of the most game-breaking weapons in all of Terraria. No bad AI to deal with, insanely high damage, and being able to grab it with just the Imp Staff fairly easily. The combination of the consistent guaranteed hits and high damage make this staff viable all the way to the end of the game pretty much, and for some it's even the preferred weapon for the daytime Empress of Light. Sanguine Staff goes into S tier easily. Now the Pirate Staff is one of the most inconsistent minions in the game, not able to deal with any flying enemies pretty much, and in hard mode most bosses are in fact flying, so we're going to put them into the F tier. But just because they're in F does not mean they're completely useless. Enemies on the ground and large events with ground enemies, they will shred through very nicely, but there's a couple better summons for that in general, so. Next we have the Blade Staff. Now there isn't much I can say about the Blade Staff that I already haven't about the Sanguine, but while I personally do prefer the Sanguine Staff, I cannot deny that the Blade Staff is just as good, especially against the mech bosses. Its low damage doesn't mean much when it ignores enemy defense, and it is incredibly easy to obtain being dropped from Queen Slime. We have to put the Blade Staff into S tier as well. The Optic Staff, only obtainable after the twins are defeated, is actually pretty decent. It's not fantastic, fast-moving enemies almost completely counter them, but enemies like the Destroyer and Plantera that move relatively slowly or have big hitboxes can make them seem quite powerful. Best case scenario for these guys is taking out the twins and using them to defeat the Destroyer. We're going to put the Optic Staff into B tier. The Pygmy Staff. The Pygmy Staff, while I do like it, I think it has uses similar to the Pirate Staff. It's just not viable for most bosses in the game. This is simply because they are stuck in place on the ground when attacking, meaning that damage against flying enemies out in the open can be very inconsistent despite their very high damage number and DPS. F tier for the Pygmy Staff. The Desert Tiger Staff. The Desert Tiger Staff functions pretty identically to Abigail and the Stardust Dragon in the sense that the more you summon, the stronger the single minion gets. And this one skyrockets in power. If you can max it out with 9 summons or even just get it to 7 for the tier 3, this thing does a ton of damage. It's a little slow, but it's the only real downside, but other weapons that are higher up can give you more consistent damage, which is why we're putting the Desert Tiger into A tier. And plus he's cute, look at him. The Deadly Sphere Staff. The Deadly Sphere Staff would be an A tier weapon if only it was available earlier in the game. It can do a ton of damage super quickly and fairly consistently, but only being available after Plantera does really hurt it. There are a few far better options at this point, including some you can get before this one. So we're going to put the Deadly Sphere Staff into B tier. The Raven Staff is basically just a hard mode Finch Staff. It doesn't do anything unique, and outside of a high damage number, the birds are a little too slow to really keep up with the competition. It does have a decent chance at the Moonlord, however, due to how little the hands and core move, which is keeping it above F just barely, putting it into C tier. Next up, we have the Xeno Staff, and this is a post-golem weapon, and it sure does act like one. The damage is very consistent since they can't really miss their attacks, and they even have some very nice viability against the daytime Empress of Light, but it just can't compete with the Sanguine or other S tier weapons in terms of availability and use in the game, so we're just going to put it in the A tier. Still very great though. Next, we have the Tempest Staff, and I actually do like the Tempest Staff. It does a very large amount of damage, but at the point where you'll be beating Fishron in a normal playthrough, it's almost completely useless. It's too slow to deal with the Empress or the Moonlord. So the only reason I haven't put this thing in F tier is because if you get something like the Sanguine Staff, and then use that to take on and beat Fishron immediately, you can use the Tempest Staff to speedrun to post Golem in pretty much an instant. Next up, we have the Stardust Dragon Staff. Now this has been utterly game-breaking ever since it got introduced. An insane amount of damage when it's maxed out, and the only real issue you'll find is him flying around enemies instead of on them, but when he touches them it does almost 5 times the damage any other summon would do. Great weapon, and it's a great choice for the daytime of Empress of Light, and my personal choice usually. S tier for the Stardust Dragon Staff. Now the Stardust Cell Staff is definitely the most overhated summon on the list. The thing is surely not nearly as powerful as its dragon counterpart, but it hits very consistently and still does a nice ton of damage for what it is. It is still far better than a lot of other minions in the game. Give it a shot and you might appreciate it a little bit more. I'm going to put it into A tier. And the Terra Prisma. What can I even say about the Terra Prisma that you don't already know? It's easily the best summon in the entire game, available as soon as you beat Plantera. All you gotta do is take on the most challenging fight in the entire game. But at this point, you have very great choice of weapons against her with the Sanguine Staff, and as long as you learn the pattern and stay consistent, you can easily get this and have it carry you through the rest of the game. That wraps up all of the minions in Terraria. I'm sure the next update will add a ton more, so we'll make sure to update this list. Let's move over to whips. First up, we have the Leather Whip. Now this whip, obtained from the zoologist after filling out the bestiary, is really bad. The only time you will ever use this is if you're doing whips only and won't let yourself use weapons before you get a whip. Terrible, bad range, and the damage fall off when hitting multiple enemies is god awful. F tier for the leather whip. Next, we have the Snapthorn. This is very easily crafted with just a few jungle trips. It's insanely good and not a big damage boost from the leather whip, but it has a way higher range, it has increased speed while attacking, and it poisons the enemy. It does so much stuff and is what you'll be using for most of pre-hard mode, at least until 1.4.5 comes out. We're going to put the Snapthorn into A tier. The Spinal Tap. Now, the Spinal Tap is not bad, but it suffers from one really big issue. You use it for exactly one boss. After beating Skeletron, you get the Spinal Tap, and then you beat the wall, and it's immediately fodder for your chests. And that's not even the worst thing, it's just not that great overall. It does better damage against large groups, which is useful for the Hungries in the wall fight, but again, that's it. It's a whip specifically made for the wall and almost nothing else. We're going to put it into C tier. Moving into hard mode, we have the Firecracker. Similarly to the Spinal Tap, the Firecracker is the whip you might just instantly replace it with, and it's used for the exact same thing. You use this weapon to go get a new whip as soon as you get into hard mode. So I have to treat it the same as the Spinal Tap and put it into the C tier. Now the Cool Whip is actually one of my favorite whips in the entire game. The extra damage that the Snowflake applies is super awesome, and this is the weapon you'll use to just shred through the Destroyer when using whips. I don't think it's S tier worthy because it does lack some of the better abilities of whips, but it's a fantastic option that you should use in any playthrough. I'm going to put the Cool Whip into A tier. Now the Durandal is just kind of a whip. It doesn't do anything super crazy, but it's a whip that you don't go out of your way to get. You're going to make this thing 100% of the time when playing Summoner, and it consistently stays with you for the full playthrough so that you can utilize the advantages that whip stacking gives you to the late game whips. Fantastic weapon that you'll use for a very long time, and you'll grow to love it dearly as it sits in your inventory. S tier for the Durandal. The Dark Harvest. Now this might be weird considering how I just talked up the Durandal and its whip stacking, and the Dark Harvest is basically the same thing, but it does more damage and an equally, if not faster, swing rate. But the issue with this is that you need to go so far out of your way to go deep into the Pumpkin Moon and hope it drops from the Pumpkin. However, once you do, we cannot deny its great use for whip stacking like the Durandal, and combining the two, it's just not as easy to obtain. I'm going to put it in the A tier. The Morning Star. I don't know if it's just me, but the Morning Star just doesn't do it. Like, it does an insane amount of damage with an insane amount of range, but the slow whip rate and the absolutely necessity of needing to whip stack with this makes it a little harder to use, and you have to go to the dungeon to grind it. It's also almost mandatory to get the best whip in the game, which, you know, we're going to put it into B tier. It's good, but it's just annoying to use. Final up the list, we have the Kaleidoscope. I don't know if I even need to talk about this thing. It does just an absolutely crazy amount of damage with a decent whip speed without needing to stack, but once you do stack, it just shreds absolutely crazy. It is a weapon definitely deserving of S tier, and hopefully, once 1.4.5 comes out, it introduces some even better and crazier whips to the game. Looking forward to it. Let's move on to Sentries. Starting off with the Sentries, we have the Houndius Shootius. Drops from Deerclops. It honestly didn't seem great when I was using it. I used a lot of the Sentries for the first time doing this video, and it has a decent chunk of damage, but it fires very slowly and does very little against all bosses, which isn't great when you need to take down a boss to get it. So we're going to put it into F tier. Keep in mind that Sentries in the grand scheme are all S tier because it's free damage when you don't have to do anything, but we're looking at the Sentries separately here. Next, we have the first of the Tavern Keep Sentries, the Lightning Aura Rod. Now, this is actually pretty decent. The AoE is great for bosses like the Eater of Worlds and the first phase of the Brain. Once the Brain goes into its second phase, or a boss is hard to hit, it's almost completely useless because it doesn't do enough knockback or damage. But I'm going to put it into C tier for that really nice use against the Eater of Worlds. Next, we have the Flame Burst Rod. Slow fire rate with a minor AoE explosion. Higher damage, but overall far less DPS than something like the Lightning Aura Rod. It has similar issues to the Houndius Shootius, so I'm going to put it in F tier as well. The Explosive Trap Rod, it's just a worse lightning rod, less consistent damage due to its lower radius. F tier weapon, I don't like it. The Ballista Rod, as far as I could tell, this was the only Sentry that I was able to kind of see where I wanted to aim, and it has piercing. Other than that, it's not much better than any of the others, but piercing is important, and it's probably the best one for the Wall of Flesh, so C tier for the Ballista Rod. Moving into hard mode, we have the Queen Spider Staff. Finally, the first decent sentry in the entire game. Good enough to stand on its own as a weapon. The only really viable way I can see you using it, however, is taking out the twins or one of the other mech bosses with a massive arena, because you can just run in a straight line, and using it to unlock the next set of tavern sentries. We're going to put it into B tier though, it's way better than the others. Next we have the Lightning Aura Cane. The Lightning Aura Cane is a very substantial upgrade to the Rod version, so much so that with it and the Monk's Armor buff, you can easily melt Master Mode Destroyer in just a couple minutes. It definitely does better when facing enemies like the Destroyer and large groups, but we're going to put it in B tier just the same. Next we have the Flame Burst Cane. It's actually somehow just as worthless as the first one. Faster fire rate is nice, but even the boost from having the special armor set does not make it worth using over anything else. F tier for the Flame Burst Cane. The Explosive Trap Cane, definitely more viable than the previous version, as well as more viable than the Flame Burst. Great against invasions like the pirates and the goblins, and it can be used against the Destroyer pretty efficiently. We'll put it into the C tier. The Ballista Cane. Now this is barely any better than the first one. For the area that we're at, none of these really provide great options for bosses like Plantera. It's far too slow, requiring you to get hit with the Squire armor for them to shoot faster. But its DPS is higher than the Flame Burst with its piercing. Either way, it's still an F tier. The Staff of the Frost Hydra. Very solid range sentry, high fire rate and high damage. First sentry in the entire list I would consider A tier, and that's exactly where we're going to put it. Even as its own weapon, it is very usable. We have the Lightning Aura Staff, the final upgrade line to the Tavern Keep sentries. Now while this weapon does do an insane amount of damage and has a super large range, it just isn't built for the late game bosses. It will absolutely shred through most of the late game events, but when it comes to using it in boss fights, it's more of a hassle than anything else. The Flame Burst Staff. Now, the only thing going for this weapon is its high damage and the explosive AoE. Otherwise, most bosses move far too fast for it, and it won't make the most difference in a fight, and not at all as a weapon itself. I'm going to be nice and just put it in the C tier, because it's the best one, but you're never going to use it. The Explosive Trap Staff, similar case to the Lightning Aura Staff here, absolutely insane damage, some of the highest you can see in the game, when you're facing an enemy that can be hit multiple times and doesn't move a ton. The Lightning Aura just has the upper edge due to its wider radius, so we're going to put it into the C tier. The Ballista Staff, exactly the same things that were wrong with the first one and the second one are here. Great damage, terrible use case as its own weapon, these fast late game enemies, even with the panic bonus from its special armor set. So, Ballista Staff, F tier, sorry. Next up we have the Lunar Portal Staff. Now this does really sadden me, because this thing is so broken. It's so good. You just can't get it until after you've beaten the game. The Moonlord drop, and the only thing I could see you using this for is the Daytime Empress of Light to try and get the Terra Prisma. I'm going to put it into S tier just because sentries are so mediocre. Now the Rainbow Crystal Staff, also a Moonlord drop. While being one of the coolest looking weapons in the game, its ability is just a little bit less powerful than the Lunar Portal Staff. It has a larger spread but much shorter range, which doesn't mean much when the Lunar Portal Staff does a giant sweeping laser attack. So I'm going to put it into A tier. It's still very good though. And I'm actually going to throw in a little bonus. I'm going to throw in the 2 armor summons that are introduced in the game and rank them alongside the sentries. First up, we have the Forbidden Armor set bonus, which lets you summon a Tornado of Sand. It's okay. I could see you using it in a challenge run maybe. It could be fun. Get some extra bonus damage against like the Destroyer. C tier. It's okay. And then we have the Stardust Guardian, available with the full set of Stardust armor. This thing's crazy. It's a JoJo's reference. What can we say? It's literally a stand, but it just kind of passively punches enemies to death when you're next to them. I want to put an S tier. In fact, if you would like to see me do a challenge run where I only use the Stardust Guardian as my weapon for the entire game, let me know. I'm way down for that. That could be fun. Definitely S tier. And that's going to wrap up the Summoner Weapon tier list. A much shorter one than all the others. I know a lot of these weapons are really good, and there's also a lot of really bad ones. So, I mean, the smaller pool means that there's more to look at in depth. I really enjoyed all these weapons, though. I enjoyed using them. This time we're wrapping up the main class weapons with the magic weapon tier list. Let's go ahead and get straight into it. But first, if you like this video and you like me, make sure to like and subscribe, and you can go and join the Discord down below to hang out with me outside of videos. And if you want to support me, you can go ahead and become a member with the join button. Obviously, you don't have to do that, so don't worry about it. Alright, let's get started with the pre-hard mode wands. First up, we have the Wand of Sparking. Now, the Wand of Sparking overall is a decent enough weapon to just grab out of a chest right at the start of the game, but the ability to immediately upgrade it and its overall mediocre damage lands it in a nice little spot in the F tier, sorry. The Wand of Frosting, however, is undoubtedly a better option than the Sparking just for how easy it is to get, as well as Frostburn being a slightly better debuff. We'll put it in C tier just for being an actual upgrade to the Wand of Sparking. They're pretty similar though. Next we have the Amethyst, Topaz, and Sapphire staves. These 3 staves are almost completely pointless when it comes to making them, as most of the staff options are, unless you're grabbing the highest tier. So we're going to put these in the F tier. Next we have the Emerald, Amber, Ruby, and Diamond staves. Now these narrowly avoid the F tier due to their high fire rate, as well as piercing up to 2 enemies instead of only hitting 1. Overall, these are very usable for being obtainable before doing anything else, but not better than some of the later staves at all. Next we have the Thunder Zapper. Now the Thunder Zapper, very similarly to the last 4 staves, narrowly avoids the F tier. This one, however, doesn't have the piercing of the staves, but it has similar damage to the highest tiers and a much faster fire rate ending in similar DPS. We're going to put it in the C tier. Next up is the Vile Thorn. Now the Vile Thorn is great. You can get it as soon as you get bombs dropping from Shadow Orbs in the Corruption, and it pierces like infinite enemies and is a great option for the Eater of Worlds and the Goblin Army. The Vile Thorn is going to end up in the B tier for its great early uses. Next we have the Weather Pane. Very similar in use to the Vile Thorn, this item is dropped by Deerclops. It pierces enemies for a short period of time and almost acts like a summon, homing in on enemies and following them until it disappears. I'm going to put the Weather Pane in A tier, it's very solid. Next we have the Aqua Scepter. The Aqua Scepter is one of my favorite dungeon weapons in the game. I'm going to throw it in the S tier for its great use against the Wall of Flesh, giving you a nice smooth entry into hard mode and being usable in those early stages as well. Next we have the Magic Missile. I'm unfortunately going to have to destroy the Magic Missile here. It's vastly inferior to the Aqua Scepter in every way, doesn't do anything against the Wall of Flesh, and can be easily replaced with an item from the Shadow Chests at exactly the same time. Decent at single target damage in hard mode, but can still be replaced with the next item, F tier for the Magic Missile. Next we have the Flame Lash. Now I really like the Flame Lash, especially over the Magic Missile. It does just a little less damage, but it can hit the enemy multiple times, or it can hit a few enemies before exploding. It also sets enemies on fire, which is great, and a far superior weapon to the Magic Missile, even into hard mode. B tier for the Flame Lash. Next we have the Flower of Fire. Now this is my least favorite weapon from the entire Shadow Chest group, but it can still do quite a bit of damage and fires decently fast, and for that alone I have to put it in the C tier. Decent weapon, but it's overall not super fun to use. Finally, moving into the hard mode wands, we have the Sky Fracture. One of the earliest wands you can get in hard mode, the Sky Fracture is super capable. It's definitely not the best of the early options, but I do like it a lot thanks to its burst damage being fairly high, and it's an okay option for the twins, so we're going to put it into the B tier. Next, we have the Meteor Staff. Now this is a fantastic weapon. It's incredibly easy to make, and it can carry you through almost all of the mech bosses and even further. It has a high mana cost, but an insane damage output, definitely an S tier weapon. This is the mage version of the Daedalus Stormbow. Next we have the Crystal Serpent. The Crystal Serpent is a very solid option for beginner hard mode mages. It can easily take care of the twins, and you can even use it as a decent option for an early Fishron fight. If it was equally as good for all 3 mech bosses, I'd put it up in the S tier, but it's pretty bad for the Destroyer, so I'm going to put it in the A tier. While I really like the Crystal Vile Shard for its aesthetic and being an upgrade to the Vile Thorn, and it being easily obtainable from Hallowed Mimics, but it just has so little use outside of some early hard mode events, and it can shred through the Destroyer, but overall, there are better weapons. If it had more widespread use, it would be better, but I'm going to have to stick it into the C tier for now. Next up, the Life Drain. The Life Drain is almost similar to the Crystal Vile Shard in a way. It has a small AoE range that does a similar amount of damage, except it gives you a life regen buff, so we're going to throw it into the B tier for that alone. The Poison Staff. Now while really solid with a decent fire rate and high damage shotgun blasts, it is not the greatest to use. It has a pretty short range and doesn't really become fantastic until it's upgraded with Chlorophyte after the mechs. I'm going to put it into C tier just because it's a weapon pretty much made for upgrading. The Frost Staff. Now the Frost Staff is basically a superior version of the Sky Fracture. It fires consistently instead of in burst, fires much faster, and inflicts a very powerful Frostburn effect. It also pierces up to 3 enemies, so we're going to throw it into the A tier. Great weapon, but I hardly ever see it used, and I never use it myself. The Flower of Frost. Now, I really hate the Flower of Frost. It has a high damage number, and it fires really fast, but it just has terrible range with its arcing ice ball, and absolutely no piercing. I'm putting it straight into the F tier. It's just a mid weapon for this point in the game. The Unholy Trident. Now, the Unholy Trident is very similar to the Frost Staff, just with a far higher damage cap, so I have to just throw it in the A tier alongside it and call it a day. It's much slower, but its damage makes up for that. Great weapon to use if you have no other options and need a quick damage up. Next up is the Rainbow Rod. Now, the Rainbow Rod is basically just an upgraded Magic Missile and Flame Lash. I think at this point in the game, it is not great. I'm going to put it in the F tier. I just don't like it that much. I'm sorry, but F tier for the Rainbow Rod. The Tome of Infinite Wisdom. Yet another Sky Fracture-esque upgrade. The Tome of Infinite Wisdom is dropped by ogres in the Old One's army, and it has a fast fire rate with its left click, and it can launch a big sand tornado with a right click, which gives it great single target damage and great damage for enemies like the Destroyer and big groups of enemies. And it can actually just completely obliterate the Destroyer as well if you're having trouble, so I'm going to put it into the A tier. Next up is the Nettle Burst. Now the Nettle Burst would be plopped straight into F tier if it had worse damage. Luckily for it, it has the perfect position of being useful in the Golem fight for dealing damage to all 3 parts in the first phase, as well as being useful in the dungeon with its insane piercing damage. However, anywhere else this thing is not great. It has terrible range for any of the post-Plantera and Golem bosses, and it's going to rest nicely in the C tier for that reason. The Venom Staff. Finally, we have the upgrade to the Poison Staff. And this thing is actually very solid. It's what I used to take out Plantera for the first time in my Wands only playthrough, and it does that job splendidly well. It's also decent for Golem, but other than that, I can't really see it having the greatest uses. It fires a decently slow projectile with a spread pattern. I'm going to put it into the B tier. It's a very good option that can help you take out a few bosses in the game. The Shadow Beam Staff. Now this is a fantastic option to take you right into the endgame of both Wands only and mages in general. It's especially a great option for Duke Fishron and other incredibly fast enemies thanks to its hit scan nature, and it's great for large groups thanks to its infinite piercing. Definitely an A tier weapon. Unfortunately, I don't think it's that good for the Moonlord, or else it would go straight into the S tier. Now, unlike the Shadow Beam Staff, the Inferno Fork has a very slow projectile, but it explodes into a fiery ball that stays around and does a ton of damage, if the enemy stays in it. It's great for situations like farming the Destroyer or taking on the Moon events, especially dealing with both the regular enemies and the mini bosses. I'm going to put it into B tier since it can't deal with most of the late game bosses, but it absolutely melts through events. The Spectre Staff. I would normally put something like this into C tier. It's a basic staff that is generally worse than both the Inferno and Shadow Beam staffs, but this weapon does have some homing potential with really high damage. Overall, I like it, but it's definitely not as good as the other two, but just not bad enough to throw into the C tier. So it goes into B tier. The Bat Scepter. I love the Bat Scepter. One of my favorite wands in the entire game. It has crazy homing and it fires out a ton of bats that just fly towards the enemy, dealing massive DPS. It's a great option for Fishron, the Empress, and even the Moonlord. It's gotta go into the S tier, definitely one of my favorite magic weapons in the game. Following up the Bat Scepter, we have the Razor Pine, and it does almost everything the Bat Scepter does, but better. The only thing I'll give the Bat Scepter over the Razor Pine is that homing ability, letting you make more distance than this weapon. But that doesn't stop this thing from shredding almost every late game boss in seconds. S tier for sure. The Blizzard Staff. Part of me really wanted to put this into the A tier, but while using it, I just realized that it's just as good as the last two. The Blizzard Staff's insane fire rate and hail of ice from the sky is just crazy. It's essentially an in-game version of the Meteor Staff and the Daedalus Stormbow, and that's just crazy. S tier for the Blizzard Staff. The Resonant Scepter. Okay. So I really like the Resonant Scepter. My only issue with it is that it's just a very small AoE when you cast it, and the fact that its best enemies are way before you'd be able to obtain this, since you need to get the princess first. Overall, I'm going to put it into B tier just for that reason alone. It's a great weapon, but its best cases are not the in-game bosses, and that's for sure. The Staff of Earth. Okay. So for a post-golem weapon, this thing is the definition of mediocre. It tries to lure you in with its crazy high damage number, but it's way too slow and its range is not fantastic since it's a projectile that has gravity. I'm going to stick into the C tier just because its high damage number can still make it useful in those late game stages and events. Betsy's Wrath. Now, as much as I want to put this into S tier, I have two major issues with it. One, Betsy. You need to get to Betsy and beat her in the tier 3 Old One's army to get this thing. And two, its range. The range of the Betsy's Wrath is just not good enough, unfortunately. If it had less of an arch to its attack, it would easily go into the S tier, but it's a little difficult to use against the game's hardest bosses, despite its insane DPS. A tier for Betsy's Wrath. Now, let's move over to the magic guns. First, we have the Space Gun. The Space Gun has experienced a crazy fall from grace for me. It used to be the preferred weapon of myself and many others against bosses like the Wall of Flesh due to that Meteor Armor set bonus, but now it can barely even stand up to some of the early bosses. It still does do a decent amount of damage, and with the Meteor Armor set bonus, it can still be pretty viable for at least grabbing the next gun on the list. C tier for the Space Gun. The B Gun. Now the B Gun here is being rated as if you were also using the Hive Pack, because let's be honest, if you're using the B Gun, you're using the Hive Pack. I really love the B Gun, and it's my personal favorite magic gun to use for pre-hard mode, and definitely for the Wall of Flesh. Being able to just make some distance and slowly whittle away while fairly safe is a great bonus. A tier for the B Gun. The Grey Zappinator. Now the Grey Zappinator is a fantastic weapon, available from the Traveling Merchant after any pre-hard mode boss has been defeated, and normally Traveling Merchant weapons are not near the top of my list due to, well, the Traveling Merchant, but this thing is crazy. It's a little RNG dependent, but no matter what, you can bet it's the highest damage dealing magic gun on any boss in pre-hard mode. S tier for the Grey Zappinator. Next, we have the Laser Rifle. Now, the Laser Rifle is actually very solid for a Wall of Flesh drop, and it has a very fast fire rate and decent damage. It can easily be used to take out the Twins or Skeletron Prime and help you progress right out of the gate in hard mode. I'm going to put it into the B tier. The Orange Zappinator. Just like the Grey Zappinator before, this thing is crazy. I'm pretty sure it's available right into hard mode from the Traveling Merchant, and it could easily take you all the way through the mechs and Plantera, and maybe even further. Great weapon, S tier for sure. The Wasp Gun. Much like the Zappinators, this upgraded version of the B gun is just as crazy. It gets buffed by the Hive Pack as well, and overall you can use this through big groups or just to get through Golem overall. It's a very, very great choice. A tier for the Wasp Gun. The Leaf Blower. Another weapon dropped by Plantera and another great magic gun. The Leaf Blower has a crazy fast fire rate and very high damage. It does almost nothing against groups, however, but its a single target damage is among the best. I have to put the Leaf Blower into the A tier. The Rainbow Gun. Now, while the Rainbow Gun has some pretty decent DPS, it's only against big groups and bosses like the Destroyer. It's really a weapon you use to just place and switch to a different weapon, but it's way too much of a hassle to try and get the perfect angle. I'm going to put the Rainbow Gun into the F tier. The Heat Ray. The Heat Ray is very similar to the Leaf Blower. It's almost a direct upgrade to it, in fact. Faster fire rate and much higher damage, a fantastic weapon against the in-game bosses, from Fishron to Empress to the Moonlord due to its hit scan beam. Very great weapon, just not as useful against those large groups of enemies. A tier for the Heat Ray. The Laser Machine Gun. Now, I don't know if this is a hot take or not, but the Laser Machine Gun is one of the best magic weapons in the game. It fires so insanely fast, and it only uses 4 mana, which means you can get just enough time to only get 1 stack of mana sickness, and it shreds every single late game boss. I'm going to put the Laser Machine Gun in the A tier just because of the next weapon. The Charged Blaster Cannon. Now this thing is insane. I really don't have anything else to say except that it's absolutely busted crazy. It averages 4k damage a second on single target bosses, and when you get a group or a boss with multiple parts, it can hit up to 40,000 damage. S tier for the Blaster Cannon, busted ass weapon. The Bubble Gun. I used to love this weapon a lot before 1.3 came out, but now in the end game, I just don't see a lot of use for this thing. The worst range of all time, and its damage is not good enough to make up for it. I'm putting the Bubble Gun into the C tier just because you can still use it against some enemies and late game events. Let's move over to spellbooks. Starting off with the Water Bolt. The Water Bolt is an insanely good spellbook for where you can get it in the game. It used to be obtainable before defeating Skeletron, but now it's not possible outside of Hoik shenanigans and special seeds. However, I'm still going to put it into the A tier for just how useful it is for getting out of hard mode as well as still being usable in hard mode. The Book of Skulls. Dropped from Skeletron, the Book of Skulls is terrible. I really hate this thing. It's not good for any boss after Skeletron, and while having some minor use in dealing with enemies even in hard mode, the next spellbook does that way better. F tier for the Book of Skulls. The Demon Scythe. Now this weapon is obtainable as soon as you get into the game. It does so much damage, and with enough use, you can get used to the delay in how it fires and really keep some distance on enemies. If you get this drop early on, it can easily carry you into hard mode and beyond. S tier for the Demon Scythe. The Cursed Flames. The Cursed Flames is a very solid early hard mode spellbook, but it just doesn't do it like its Crimson counterpart does. It has a limited range, acting almost like one of the Flower Wands, and that alone really bumps it down all the way to the B tier. The Golden Shower. Now, dumb name aside, the Golden Shower is a glorious spellbook. It's easily obtainable right into hard mode, and you can just melt through the mech bosses, and more importantly, it can be used in a long and arduous fight against Duke Fishron to get the Razorblade Typhoon right out of the gate. S tier for the Golden Shower. The Crystal Storm, when compared to its 2 other early counterparts, is easily my least favorite of the 3. It doesn't have piercing to deal with groups, its single target damage is great, but only against big enough enemies that its rapid firing slow projectiles can hit consistently. It's not terrible, so I'm going to put it into the C tier, just not my favorite. The Magnet Sphere. I don't know if this is another dart weapon situation, and I'm just using this wrong, but it's so bad. It doesn't do nearly enough damage for how slow it moves and how slow it attacks from the ball. I don't know, I don't have much to say other than this thing is the definition of not good. F tier for the Magnet Sphere. The Razorblade Typhoon, easily one of the best magic weapons in the entire game, let alone one of the best spellbooks. Just take the Golden Shower and take out Fishron to grab this thing in a spellbooks only playthrough and beat the game in the next 2 hours. Great weapon, S tier, no doubt. The Lunar Flare. Unfortunately for the mages out there, the Lunar Flare is locked behind the final boss in the game, and its only real use would be taking out the Daytime Empress, and I don't even think it's the greatest for that. If it was one of the Nebula weapons instead, I'd put it in S for sure, but being locked behind postgame really bumps it down into the A tier. Finally, we have the other category. Starting off, we have the Crimson Rod, the one and only pre-hard mode magic weapon in this category, and overall, it's okay. It is obviously a weapon to be used alongside other weapons, and with that, it cannot be F tier due to it being a free bit of extra damage. But in pre-hard mode, it's only really viable against the Brain of Cthulhu and Eater worlds, as well as groups of enemies, so I'm just going to put it into the C tier for its rather limited use case in pre-hard mode, and I hope the next update does add some more weapons into this category for pre-hard mode. The Ice Rod. Now the Ice Rod is definitely meant to be more of a tool than it is a weapon, but it's in the list, so we're gonna rank it. It has a surprisingly decent level of damage and a pretty high fire rate, but its uses are severely limited. That's because it creates a block if it doesn't connect with an enemy, and while it can fire through them, you cannot travel through them. So it does make some obstacles for you, but I think the weapon does actually have a decent enough use at the start of hard mode, just for being able to find the wizard and buy it. You can use it to take on some enemies for much better weapons later in the list. C tier for the Ice Rod as well. The Magic Dagger. Now, I debated on this thing's spot for a while. I tested it on a variety of hard mode bosses, and overall I have to ask, is this the best magic weapon in the game? Super fast fire rate, insanely high DPS, it pierces a couple of enemies at a time, and it has an incredibly low mana cost. I think the Magic Dagger has to go in S tier. It can carry you through the mechs, and it even seemed to do decent against Plantera. Insane weapon. Medusa's Head. Now Medusa's Head is an odd weapon. It only works if you're close to an enemy, making it a short range weapon. It can hit 3 enemies at a time and actually does decent damage without needing to aim or anything. Being able right at the start of hard mode, you can use this to easily farm out tons of enemies, and that is its specialty. It can even do some decent enough work against the Destroyer. C tier for Medusa's Head just because of how little defense mages have and how close you have to be. The Clinger Staff. The Clinger Staff, dropped by Corrupt Mimics, is basically a corruption version of the Nimbus Rod in a way, except it's much shorter and it goes vertically. Overall, I think the weapon is actually pretty solid, but I feel like there are other weapons you can get that do the same thing, and especially one that's much better in the Nimbus Rod itself. I'm gonna put it into C tier, but I do recognize it's fantastic against groups of enemies due to its knockback. The Spirit Flame. I was genuinely surprised when I was testing out this weapon. It's available so early on and relatively easy at that. It just does so much damage and it can easily take care of the mechs all the way up to Golem. I don't know if this weapon has any downsides outside of having the slow fire rate and projectile against those faster enemies. But even against like the twins, it didn't really matter. Not being able to target specific enemies is another downside, but not big enough to make this thing come out of the S tier. The Shadow Flame Hex Doll. I used to love this thing when it first got introduced in 1.3, but now I'm not too high on it. It's a really solid weapon, but it has one major downside, and that is, again, mages don't have high defense. And this thing's range is pretty short, meaning you have to get right in there on bosses and enemies. It's great against the Destroyer, but you're going to end up dead long before it takes out the boss fully. I'm going to put it into B tier, just because it is really solid against a couple of bosses and most groups of enemies, and it has a little bit more range than the Medusa's Head. The Bloodthorn. This is basically a slightly altered version of the Shadow Flame Hex Doll. It is actually very decent, but it has probably the biggest negative out of any of these weapons. Your enemy has to be on the ground or near a platform for them to get hit, and that makes it a lot worse. But hard mode does have a lot of events with ground enemies, and it can shred the Destroyer, no doubt. It also has some decent use against Golem, but nothing crazy. I'm gonna put the Bloodthorn into the C tier. The Nimbus Rod. The Nimbus Rod is literally just the hard mode version of the Crimson Rod, and it's so much better. With bosses like the Destroyer in the way and all of the events that this thing can help in, as well as being completely usable all the way to the end of the game, even if it's just for a bit of chip damage. I'm going to put it into the A tier just because in the end game, it's not going to help with a lot of those bosses like it does early on. The Magical Harp. The Magical Harp is actually a sick weapon. Obtainable after defeating the twins, you could take them out and use this thing to just shred through the Destroyer with its infinite piercing slow projectiles. The only bad thing this weapon has is against any other boss in the game, the slow projectiles are going to be hard to use, but I have to say its use in events and some of these bosses has to put it up in the A tier. The Toxic Flask. Now I really like the Toxic Flask, and it's not just because an NPC in my mod is modeled after Dr. Manfly. The Toxic Flask is a post-Plantera weapon that just excels at the bosses and events like the Moons and Golem. Other than that, it's not the greatest, as fast bosses can move out of the cloud pretty quickly, and overall, it's just really made for crowd control. I'm gonna put it into the B tier. The Night Glow. The Night Glow is basically just an amped up version of the Spirit Flame, which means it's just as good at the bare minimum, but this thing goes far beyond. It still has a somewhat slow fire rate, but its projectiles are very, very fast, and its damage is just so insane. Decent against the Moonlord, but the other Empress drop is just far superior in my opinion, so I'm gonna put this one into the A tier. Here it is, the Stellar Tune. This might be tied for the best late game mage weapon in the game. It fires crazy fast, it has an odd pattern, but they seek enemies, so it makes up for it a little bit. It does little AoE explosions as well, and it's almost like the mage version of the Celebration Mark II. I love it, and it definitely deserves a spot in the S tier. The Nebula Arcanum. I really think this weapon is good, don't get me wrong. And it's definitely near the top of the list, but I just wish it was better against bosses. The only boss I really see this thing having use against is the Empress, and especially in daytime since you can just spam it and focus on dodging while it shreds her whenever she slows down. But I think the Nebula Blaze might actually just be better, so I'm putting the Arcanum into the B tier. The Nebula Blaze. Absolutely insane weapon. One of the best in the entire game. Its high damage and slight homing blasts with a high fire rate make this thing an absolute monster. And I would say it's probably the best magic weapon in the game before Moonlord. I have to put this thing into the S tier just because it has so much insane use against any situation in the game. Finally, the last Prism. Even with this thing's crazy mana consumption, it is completely worth it, especially if you're having trouble against the Daytime Empress. This thing can get you all the way through both phases in mere seconds, barely even letting the boss get its attacks off. So if you're having trouble with that, use the last Prism and grab your Terra Prisma. The last Prism has to go into the S tier. And that wraps up the Terraria Mage Weapon tier list. If you disagree with any of these picks, make sure to let me know in the comments, and if you didn't like something about this video, also let me know. So I'm gonna go ahead and get straight into it. Let's start off with the swords. First up, we have all of the wooden swords. And I mean, what can I really say about the wooden swords? We all know they're bad, only used at the start of a playthrough for a grand total of like 5 minutes before you find something better. We gotta throw them in the F tier easily. Next up, we have the ore short swords. Similar to the wooden swords, the ore short swords are actually even more worthless somehow. You need harder resources to craft them, and let's just say there's a reason most people just throw away their copper short sword. F tier again. Next up, we have the ore broadswords. Now, I'm going to give the ore broadswords the benefit of the doubt here. They are definitely more usable than the wooden swords and short swords, but you're still only really using these for a small section of the playthrough, and you'll most likely be using these to take on all of your enemies. If there was a D tier, I'd put them in that, but for now, I'll rest them into the F tier, but like in the middle more so. Next up, the cactus sword. F tier. Zombie sword. With a rework prepared for 1.4.5, this weapon might be good, but not yet. F tier. Ant lion mandible. F tier. F bad, bad F. F tier bad. Bone sword, F tier once again. Now let me clarify, I think a lot of these basic swords are actually somewhat usable against like groups of enemies and stuff, but pre-hard mode only has one event you're gonna need to do, and that's the goblins, which are not very hard. Sorry swords, F tier you go. The katana, the candy cane sword, and the exotic scimitar. For the sake of time, since there are 900 swords, I'm shoving these three all together. All these are fine, but like the previous explanation, just not worth getting. If there was a D, once again, I'd put them in that, but for now, F tier. The bladed glove. Let's take a break from the F tier for no other reason that Nightmare on Elm Street is my favorite of the classic horror giants. Yep, that's it. Also, this weapon does attack fast enough to keep enemies away. C tier. The gladius, the falcon blade, the tentacle spike, purple clubberfish, and bat. Let's go back into the F tier with a big group of weapons. All of the following I don't think are good enough to make it out of the F tier. They are either too slow or don't do enough damage or don't have enough range to make them worth using. Phase blades. Now, even though the phase blades all have decent damage and speed, they are not any better than the previous group of weapons until they get that upcoming rework, which might skyrocket them up the rankings. But that's for the next updates tier list. F tier for the phase blades. The ice blade, finally the first real weapon. The Ice Blade is a very decent sword. Its damage is worse than some of those true melee weapons from before, but it has a projectile, and I believe it's the first weapon you'll reasonably use against the Eye of Cthulhu. It's not much better than that, however, I'm going to leave it in the C tier. The Enchanted Sword. The Enchanted Sword is the OG GOAT. A high damage weapon with a high damage projectile, leaving it both good for groups as well as taking out early bosses. Since it's just a better Ice Blade, I'm going to give it the B tier because you could probably use this against some harder bosses with some care. The Star Fury. Now the Star Fury is a fantastic weapon. You just get yourself a gravity potion and this will honestly be your main sword for a long time in pre-hard mode. It will carry you through those important early game bosses and events and give you a great stepping stone into the best equipment. A tier for the Star Fury. The Beekeeper. Now I actually really like the Beekeeper. I'm a big bee girl, bees are great. I just think its pre-hard mode sword melee range is a large hindrance to how powerful it can be. I'm gonna put it into the B tier. B tier, B, get it? B tier. The Light's Bane. I don't think either of the evil swords are that great here, and while I like the effect of the weapon and its lingering damage slash, it's way too short and the damage is not high enough. C tier. The Blood Butcherer, the opposite of the Light's Bane, both in evil and downsides. While the range of the Blood Butcherer is not the worst, it is a true melee weapon, and even though the bleed is rather strong, you have to actually hit with the melee strike. C tier for the Blood Butcher. The Blade of Grass. Now, it is a fantastic option, even though I find it to be one of the more forgettable options in the list of swords, usually only making it when I'm ready for the Knight's Edge, but by itself, it still has some very solid potential with its projectile and powerful poison. I'm going to put it into the B tier. The Volcano. I really love the Volcano. It was the saving grace in my swords only playthrough during pre-hard mode, getting me through Skeletron, which was a big hurdle at the time. It also just shreds through basic enemies and events. A tier for the Volcano for sure. The Muramasa. I don't really know what this weapon is used for outside of the Knight's Edge. There's not many bosses left at this point in progression, and all the events are done, maybe besides the Old One's army, but I just don't think it's great. It has a nice DPS and decent range on the swing, so I'm going to put it into B tier at least, because it is just as usable as the Volcano. The Knight's Edge. I mean, it's S tier. The Knight's Edge is crazy, absolutely shreds through the wall of flesh and every boss you could fight in pre-hard mode. And it can cook in the early hard mode stages while grabbing your upgrades. It's a fantastic weapon, no doubt that it's S tier. The Umbrella, the Tragic Umbrella, the Breathing Reed, the Ruler, and the Stylish Scissors. Alright, so all of these weapons are gimmick weapons. The Stylish Scissors being a drop from the Stylus like the Scimitar from before, but laughably short with its range, and literally all of the others are tools that just happen to have melee attacks. F tier for all of them. Moving on to the hard mode swords, we've got the Pearlwood Sword. I mean, do I really need to say anything here? F tier. The Classy Cane, similarly, do I need to say much? F tier, it's a joke weapon. The Slap Hand, you know as much as I do that I really want to put the Slap Hand into F tier, but that knockback is kind of crazy though, and also just kind of funny, and for that, C tier. The Breaker Blade, although I don't particularly think the Breaker Blade is the greatest sword, I think if you were to get this coming straight into hard mode, it can easily fend off the basic enemies for a long time while you spend the time to set up. B tier for the Breaker Blade. The Phase Sabers. The Phase Sabers are just straight upgrades from the Phase Blade as soon as you get into hard mode. And while they are decent, I think something like the Knight's Edge or the Breaker Blade are going to be much more useful for you at the beginning of hard mode. C tier for the Sabers. The Hambat. Now, despite the Hambat's nice bonus to your life regen, its short range is not great to have this far into a playthrough, and overall, those positives cannot outweigh its negatives. F tier. The Blade Tongue. The Blade Tongue is one of the weapons I slept on in my first tier list. This thing is very solid. It has an incredibly low range, but against crowds and even bosses like the Destroyer where you can get close easily, the Iger Stream it fires do so much for it. I think if it had a bit more range, it'd be higher, but I'm going to give it the B tier. The Fetid Bognox. The Fetid Bognox are actually pretty crazy if you've never used them before. Get like a tanky melee speed build going, and just shred through the enemies at crazy speeds. Not the greatest, but I do think it deserves a spot in the B tier for just how unique the weapon is. Cobalt and Palladium Swords. There is no reason to use these. F tier. The Mithril and Orichalcum Swords. There is no reason to use these. F tier. Adamantite and Titanium Swords. Once again, no reason. F tier. The Icicle. Basically our first projectile weapon in hard mode, and it's decent. I wish the projectile was maybe a bit bigger or lasted longer, but it can definitely give you some much needed space against the hard mode bosses. B tier for the Icicle. The Frostbrand. I think the Frostbrand is very similar to the Icicle, and almost everything I said for it, I could save for the Frostbrand. I'm just gonna stick it into the same tier in B. Cutlass. Now I know there are some Cutlass defenders out there, and I'm here to say that I am not one of them. This thing is a terrible range true melee weapon. It can swing fast enough to keep enemies off of you, but so can better weapons that are also easier to get. No point in ever getting this thing. F tier. The Beam Sword. Incredibly hard to get. It sucks. Get the Frostbrand instead. F tier. The Excalibur. Excalibur is a fantastic weapon. I think it's one of the best true melee weapons due to its insane reach and fast speed. Decent option against the Destroyer and actually decent against Skeletron due to its high damage. But getting its upgraded form so shortly after definitely bumps it down a tier. B tier for the Excalibur. The Chlorophyte Saber. Now this thing is actually a sleeper. I don't think it's as good as a lot of the higher placed weapons for sure, but it swings fast, and even with its low range, it has this little green cloud that hits pretty quick. B tier for the Saber. The Chlorophyte Claymore. Similar to the Excalibur, this weapon has a large range, but it actually shoots out a piercing orb that makes it fantastic against large groups, as well as keeping some distance in a boss fight. It's not good enough to solo the bosses right after getting it, however, so I'm going to put it into the B tier. The Seedler. Okay, so I may have been too tough on the Seedler in the original tier list. I also may have been completely wrong. This thing is absolutely an A tier weapon. The sword itself is nothing crazy, but its projectile is one of the best you can get at this stage of the game. It's an amazing weapon against Golem, and it shoots fast enough that you can easily use it against some harder bosses as well. A tier for the Seedler. The Brand of the Inferno. Okay, so the Brand of the Inferno I was also pretty hard on, but I think I was actually right with this one. It's a true melee weapon with a really fast speed and high enough damage. Its special gimmick is that you can right click and give yourself a quick defense buff, which is fine, but I don't find it that useful overall as a weapon. C tier for the Brand of the Inferno. The Death Sickle. Now this is an all-time favorite of mine and many people, and I think it actually still manages to live up to those standards. It has an amazing projectile with high damage available right after the mech bosses. It's a great weapon against Plantera, the Moon Events, and Golem. A tier for the Death Sickle. The True Knight's Edge. So I think I may have rated this a bit too high last time. It is a great weapon, but its projectile leaves a lot to be desired damage and control-wise, and the swing itself isn't fantastic. I'm gonna put it into the B tier for this list. True Excalibur. Similarly, I definitely overrated this one in the last tier list. I still do really like this weapon a lot, and I like it more than the Knight's Edge, but overall, I think it's no more useful than it. B tier as well. The Terra Blade. The combination of the last two weapons is still to this day a great weapon all around. There's no real downside to it, swings fast, does crazy damage, and has a fast and piercing projectile. This can easily take you to the end game. It goes in S tier. The Horseman's Blade. The Horseman's Blade is definitely the weapon that the most people yelled at me for in the comments of the last list, and you know what? Fine, you were alright. The Horseman's Blade is great. Decent against bosses if you're tanky enough, and fantastic against large groups of enemies. I'll give it the A tier. The Key Brand. I still hate this one though. Key Brand is terrible. It's a post-Plantera true melee weapon that is outclassed by every other weapon around it. F tier. The Psycho Knife. The Psycho Knife is generally one of the greatest weapons in Terraria. That doesn't mean it's good though. Incredibly small range, and even its high damage and insane attack speed can't make up for that. Fun to use though, F tier. Christmas Sword. I really enjoy the Christmas Sword actually. I know, it's kind of crazy what happens when you actually use the weapons. Its projectiles are utterly fantastic, allowing you to get consistent damage even if you miss with the OG projectile. A tier for the Christmas Tree Sword. The Influx Waver. Okay, so I wanted to put this in A tier just because I didn't want to admit how wrong I really was. But this thing, with its fast projectile, that then auto hits with like 3 more, is so good. Its swing is terrible for sure, but its fast projectile puts it up into S tier. It's just as good as the Terra Blade easily. The Flying Dragon. So while I think this weapon is a little boring and could definitely use a rework of some kind, I have to admit that it is just as good, if not better, than the Terra Blade. So for that, I have to put it into the S tier. The Consequences of the Terra Blade. The Starlight. Okay, fine. Starlight isn't all that great, but I still really love it for being incredibly unique and trying to make a late game short sword that works well. And it does do that still. I'm gonna put it into the A tier because I like it. The Star Wrath. Now the Star Wrath is a fantastic sword, probably the best in the game if we aren't counting the Zenith as one. Insanely fast swing speed and a super powerful barrage of stars that can easily deal with any boss or event. S tier for sure. The Meowmere. Just like the other S tier weapons, this one easily deserves the spot. I think it's just as good as the Star Wrath despite a weaker projectile. It gives you more direct accuracy and I really enjoy using it. S tier. The Zenith. A lot of people were really confused by my omitting the Zenith in the last video, but it's because they didn't watch the thing. The Zenith is technically classified as an other weapon, but just for you, I'm gonna put it into the S tier in swords. And really, it deserves its own spot above S due to how insanely OP it is compared to literally everything else in the game. Let's go ahead and move out of swords and on to yo-yos. The Wooden Yo-Yo. There isn't much to talk about with the Wooden Yo-Yo. It's definitely one of the better melee weapons that you could craft early on. As a yo-yo, it is definitely not great. F tier. The Rally. Now this is a rare drop from certain enemies down in the caves, but being able to get it early can give you a much higher boost in your early game and easily get you through the Eye, King Slime, and Goblin army. I'm going to put it into the C tier just because I think you could just as easily use the Wooden Yo-Yo to craft yourself a better one than get this one. The Malaise and the Artery. The Malaise and Artery I'm going to group together due to being the World Evil weapons, but they are both just slightly above average. Good damage yo-yos, nothing too insane about either of them, but perfectly usable. I'm going to put them right into the B tier. The Amazon. Alright, the Amazon continues to be just an absolutely insane weapon. Super easy to craft right out of the gate, and it has enough raw power to just carry you through a good portion of pre-hard mode. I'm going to keep saying it's S tier just for how bad the yo-yo power scaling is in Terraria. The Code 1. The Code 1's only downside is it being tied to the Traveling Merchant, and I almost never see this thing. If it were more easily obtainable, it'd be S tier for sure. But that alone has me bumping it down to the A tier. Otherwise, it's a fantastic weapon pre-Skeletron, but there is still a better choice. Okay, now the high five is Based. I love this yo-yo. Most B weapons are pretty good in Terraria, and yo-yos already have an edge on everything else. I genuinely think this is a sleeper S tier weapon, so I'm throwing it up in there. The Valor. Okay, so the Valor really isn't terrible, all things considered, except that I hate it. There's almost no point in using this yo-yo because at the same time, you can get a far better one, and even the yo-yos before this one have more use. F tier for the Valor, it's probably my least favorite yo-yo. The Cascade. The Cascade is definitely the best yo-yo to take with you into hard mode and a decent enough option at Wall of Fresh to progress you through the game. I'm going to put it in the A tier just because you do end up replacing it fairly quickly, so it does not deserve that S tier spot. The Format C. The Format C actually isn't even bad, but the main thing here is that it's a weapon you have to buy from the Skeleton Merchant during a specific moon phase, when you can just get a far better yo-yo right away without needing to get lucky. F tier for that alone. The Gradient. The exact same issues as the Format C. The increased damage for this one is a lot better, but still there are better weapons available that are way easier. F tier. The Sheik. The Sheik is easily the weakest of the early hard mode yo-yos, but it is super easy to craft and you can use it to get the better ones even easier. I'm going to put it into the C tier, easy to get, still decently useful. The Hellfire. The Hellfire is one of the 2 game-breaking yo-yos in early hard mode, and one of the reasons yo-yos needs a massive power balance. It hits fast, inflicts on fire, and has a long reach, as well as being attainable straight into hard mode. I'm going to put it into the A tier just because the next yo-yo is so much crazier. The Amarok. The Amarok is the strongest yo-yo obtainable pre-mech bosses and is super easy to get at that. Plus it has the highest possible damage with its Frostburn debuff and a nice speed and range. This yo-yo alone practically obliterates the yo-yo progression in the game. Something definitely needs to be changed, but this yo-yo is going into the S tier. The Code 2. Now the Code 2 is obtainable after any mech boss is defeated, but by the Traveling Merchant. There are very few weapons that can still be worth if they're locked to the Merchant, and this is definitely not one of them. Does nothing better than the previous yo-yos or the later yo-yos. F tier for sure. The Yellets. The Yellets is another yo-yo obtainable right after any mech boss has been defeated, but this one you can actually get really easily from any enemy in the jungle. And it's overall a decent upgrade from the yo-yos you'll have. I'm going to put it into the B tier just because there are a few other yo-yos you could grind out if you wanted. The Red's Throw and Valkyrie yo-yo. These 2 yo-yos can be obtained at any point in hard mode from hard mode boss treasure bags as a part of vanity sets, and they are very, very good. You might not ever see these in a playthrough, but you could set yourself up for some easy mech boss grinding and just go crazy and hope you get one. I'm going to put them into the A tier just because there is a decently high chance that you just don't obtain either of these sets. The Kraken. The Kraken is a post-Plantera dungeon drop, able to be obtained from any enemy in there, and overall it's really solid. I wouldn't say it's entirely worth going out and farming for, however. It does a decent amount of damage, but not enough where you would have to go replace your older yo-yo with it, especially when you only need to take out Golem for the best pre-in-game yo-yo after this. Overall, I'm going to put it into the B tier. The Eye of Cthulhu. The Eye of Cthulhu is an incredibly easy yo-yo to get. Right after Golem, just head over to the Solar Eclipse realm and farm out some Mothrons. It's a high chance to drop, so you're definitely going to get one, and it's a massive damage jump. It's the yo-yo you're going to take through the rest of the game. I'm going to give it the S tier. The Terrarian. The Terrarian, whatever. Hands down the best yo-yo and one of the best melee weapons in all of Terraria actually, giving you both the power of the late game yo-yos and it rapidly shoots out these little balls that do even more crazy damage. Definitely one of the goats and a great option against Daytime Empress. I'm going for the S tier easily. Let's get out of yo-yos and move on to spears, my favorite melee weapon class. The Spear. The spear is obtainable from basic wooden chests from the start of the game. It does carry some use in being able to prevent groups of enemies from hitting you super easily with its knockback. Unfortunately, you can get 2 better spears at the exact same time, and one of them just as easily. I've got to put it into the F tier. The Trident. Similar to the spear in almost every way, this weapon is just a slight upgrade. Better damage and slightly faster, obtainable just as easily. I think you can't really put it any higher than the spear itself though, since they're almost exactly the same. So it goes in the F tier too. The Storm Spear. Now the Storm Spear is a fantastic early option, perfect for taking out the early pre-hard mode bosses, getting you a bit of range to work with to keep yourself alive. I'm going to put it up into the A tier just for how useful it is early on. And you can honestly use this even further against something like Skeletron. The Rotted Fork. This weapon is almost exclusively good for something like the Brain and the dungeon itself. Otherwise, it's just a glorified, cool looking version of the base sphere. It is powerful though, so I'm going to put it into the C tier. The Swordfish. This thing is actually bad. Like, it attacks fast and has higher damage than everything else, but you gotta be right on the enemy with it. It's no better than any of the other spears at dealing with normal enemies either. F tier. The Dark Lance. The Dark Lance is actually incredibly solid. Obtainable after Skeletron in the Shadow Chest, it has a fast speed and decent range. It also, in its newest rework, inflicts the Shadow Flame debuff with its little shockwave. It actually grows in size based on your melee speed. It's not great enough to be an S tier, and maybe not even an A due to where it's at in the game. I'm going to put it into the B tier. The Cobalt Naginata, the Palladium Pike, the Mithril Halberd, and the Orichalcum Halberd. Let's be real, who in their right mind is ever crafting and then using these weapons? You're just going to skip to the final set. F tier. The Adamantite Glaive and Titanium Trident. The final set of spears for the hard mode ore are not much better than the others, but the fact that you will probably make these and use these at least bumps them up to the C tier. Obsidian Swordfish. Literally, why does this exist? F tier. The Gungnir. This is the first really great spear in the game, crafted with hallowed bars, really solid, great damage, and is what you'll use to clean up the rest of the mech bosses for sure. You could even take it to Plantera if you wanted. I'm going to put it into the A tier. The Chlorophyte Partisan. The Chlorophyte Partisan is pretty decent. I don't think it's better than the Gungnir, but I do like the little poison cloud you get with it, giving you some extra range. I think this is the perfect weapon for the B tier. The Mushroom Spear. I don't know if it's just me, but while testing this weapon, I just didn't see anything that special about it. The mushrooms don't give you any extra range, and its damage doesn't really make up for it. I'm just going to put it into the C tier since it's not entirely useless. The Ghastly Glaive. Much like the Mushroom Spear, I don't really see what's super special about this one. It has a very short range, and it seems almost made for the event that you get it from in the Old One's army, like most weapons. It does have high damage potential, but only against groups of enemies. C tier, just because I don't see the use for it. The North Pole. Now, the North Pole is the one and only S tier spear on the list. It gives you a great ranged projectile that leaves behind a trail of snowflakes, and is definitely the weapon you'll be using to finish out the game. I think it does deserve that S tier spot for that alone, but please give us more and better spears, please Terraria. And finally, the Jousting Lances. I decided to just throw in all of the Jousting Lances of the spear section. They are not great. They have high damage potential, but they're really gimmick weapons more than anything else. I'm gonna throw them into the C tier. Alright, ending out the spears, let's move on to the Boomerangs. Starting with the Wooden Boomerang. The Wooden Boomerang is not actually the worst thing ever. It has decent knockback, but it's slow and has low damage, but mainly its biggest downside is that you can easily upgrade it into something way better. So I'm going to put it into the F tier. The Enchanted Boomerang. Now the Enchanted Boomerang is a lot better than the Wooden Boomerang, and all you need is some Fallen Stars, and you can upgrade that straight into it. Overall, a very solid upgrade that you will grab anytime you're using the Wooden Boomerang, so for that, I'm going to put it into the C tier. The Shroomerang. Now the Shroomerang is not much different from the Enchanted Boomerang, it's just significantly harder to obtain. But it makes up for that with even more damage than the Enchanted, so I'm just going to throw it in the same spot around C tier. The Ice Boomerang. The Ice Boomerang is basically just the Enchanted Boomerang with Frostburn, and that's great. Especially if you're on a Crimson world, it can be super useful for marking the real brain of Cthulhu in the fight. I'm going to put it into the B tier. The Trimarang. The Trimarang is the ultimate upgrade for the last three, all combining into this one. Overall, a fantastic boomerang and one that you'll probably use in conjunction with others until the end of pre-hard mode. I'm going to say for how early you can get it and how far it can take you, it has to go into the A tier at least, especially with being able to throw multiple. The Flamerang. The Flamerang is probably the closest thing to an S tier boomerang in pre-hard mode, but I just don't think any of the pre-hard mode boomerangs deserve that spot. The Flamerang is made using Hellstone and has a crazy high damage number and can be used to just shred through Skeletron. And it's a very powerful weapon against the wall while combined with others. We're going to put it into the A tier. The Fruitcake Chakram. The Fruitcake Chakram is on a similar power level to the Enchanted. It's a bit faster and the damage per second is very similar. But despite it being a Christmas time only weapon, it is going to grab a spot in C tier. The Thorn Chakram. This boomerang is definitely one of the best you can grab in the pre-boss portion of the game. Just head to the jungle and grab some easy materials. This thing is easily on par with stuff like the Ice Boomerang, but not quite the Trimarang or Flamerang. It gets a nice little spot in B tier. The Bloody Machete. Okay, so the Bloody Machete is available during Halloween, and while being a little bit stronger than the Fruitcake Chakram from Christmas, this one has one major downside, and that's if you miss, your punishment is way worse, because it has to fall until it hits the ground before bouncing back to you. I'm not putting it any higher than C tier. The Combat Wrench. Now the Combat Wrench is actually a fantastic weapon. You get it by killing the mechanic NPC, and it honestly might be in the top 3 boomerangs of pre-hard mode. It's great for boss fights, being able to hit an enemy multiple times, and has piercing, which is the only pre-hard mode boomerang to do so, I believe. I'm going to put it into the A tier. But into hard mode, we got the Flying Knife. Alright, so imagine this. You finally make it into hard mode, you choose to go after some hallowed mimics, and when this thing drops, you use it for the first time, you're like, okay, it's a decent weapon. But you're wrong, because it's actually a boomerang that literally can't miss, has infinite piercing and infinite airtime. This thing is crazy for early hard mode melee, letting you keep a far distance from the mech bosses while easily dealing with them. S tier for sure, this thing's so nuts. The Bananarang. The Bananarang is another fantastic early hard mode boomerang. This one is not nearly as insane as the Flying Knife, but it has a ton of extra damage and you can throw like 5 at a time. It's almost S tier, but I don't think it has the craziness factor that the Flying Knife does. A tier for sure though. The Sergeant United Shield. Now the Sergeant United Shield is amazing. It's a boomerang that just homes in on multiple enemies before returning to you, and with that it has a crazy high damage. The only downside this weapon has is being a traveling merchant weapon, and that's why I'm going to put it into A tier instead of S. The Light Disc. The Light Disc is actually a pretty decent weapon, My only issue is that it doesn't really do much for you at this point compared to some of the weapons we've already seen. The Boomerang does the same thing with just slightly worse damage, and that's available at a much better spot for a basic multi-throw boomerang. I'm going to put it into the B tier personally, but I'll also accept A. The Paladin's Hammer. The Paladin's Hammer is a fantastic weapon, hitting any enemies in its path twice, going back and forth. The only thing that could be remotely considered bad about it is its pretty short range, but I think its power makes up for it, especially when you're going to be taking on stuff like the moon events around this time. A tier for sure. The Possessed Hatchet. The Possessed Hatchet dropped by the lovely Golem is actually his best drop. And it's so good that in the Boomerang playthrough, it's what you'll be using until you beat the game most likely, and even if not, it's a great option to grind out some of those crazier melee weapons. But overall, this weapon is definitely S tier. Let's move on over to Flails, starting with the Chain Knife. While the Chain Knife can get you some pretty decent early DPS, it has a very little range compared to even the most basic of flails, and you'd be insanely close to the enemy to get that peak DPS, which in the early game can be very, very bad. F tier. The Mace. The Mace is actually really solid for a basic chest weapon. It's nothing crazy, but it can get some work in for you. I'm still going to be putting it into the F tier, however, because of the next weapon, which uses this as material. The Flaming Mace. The Flaming Mace is a direct upgrade to the Mace, and it only needs torches, having the same amount of damage but with the added effect of fire, which makes it very solid. I'm going to move it up to the C tier, almost B tier, but the range on it holds it back. The Ball of Hurt. The Ball of Hurt isn't anything super special, but it has a fast speed and a lot larger range than the previous flails. I think that and its massive damage boost earns it a spot in at least B tier. The Meatball. The Meatball is basically the same as the Ball of Hurt, very similar damage, similar point in the game that you get it. The only real difference here is that the Meatball weirdly needs to be crafted instead of obtained from the Shadow Orbs and Hearts, which makes it a lot less useful at this exact point, but not enough to take it out of the B tier. The Blue Moon. The Blue Moon is actually a great high damage weapon. The only issue is that it's the next flail in the game progression, meaning you have to use the last two to beat Skeletron, and then you can get this one from the dungeon, or you can go get a far better one at the same time from Shadow Chests. Its high damage does still keep it in the C tier, however, but it could easily go down in F. The Sun Fury. The Sun Fury is easily the best pre-hard mode flail. It's the last one you get usually, and it's what you'll use to wrap it up, and even what you'll use to get yourself deeper into hard mode and grabbing those other flails. It has insane damage, and the on fire debuff is fantastic, so I'm going to throw it up into the A tier. Moving into hard mode, we got the Chain Guillotine. So I was definitely pretty tough on the Chain Guillotines in the first list, but having used them through the mech boss stage of the game now, they are just absolutely fantastic, especially when up against the twins. I don't think it's absolutely game destroying, but it definitely deserves to be up in A tier. The Anchor. So the Anchor is definitely a weapon, one of the flails of all time. I don't really like this thing. Unlike the main set of flails, it doesn't have the wind-up attack and just flies straight out. It also doesn't pierce, and overall it's just not that good. F tier for me. The Tao of Pow. Now the Tao of Pow is a fantastic weapon. Pretty high damage, insanely long range, and one of the perfect early hard mode weapons to take on the Destroyer with its piercing. I'm going to put it into the B tier just because it's not that useful against the other two mech bosses. The Drippler Crippler. Now the Drippler Crippler is actually kind of crazy. Easily obtained from the Blood Moon Blood Eels, and has the highest damage out of any of these early hard mode flails. That alone, plus its ability to shred through the Destroyer and even some of the mid hard mode bosses, puts it up in the A tier. It's just not that great against some of the faster ones. The Flower Pow. So the Flower Pow dropped by Plantera is a pretty unique flail. When you let it drop down, you can actually just let it sit there and shoot homing flower petals, and that's super good. Flails are pretty hard to use normally, so being able to have an alternate use that's just as good is fantastic. I'm going to put it into the B tier, however, just because you have to let the flail sit there in place to use it properly. The KO Cannon. So this is basically the early hard mode version of the Chain Knife, and it's terrible. It has so little range, and there are so many better options that you can use, especially since this is basically completely useless against any hard mode boss. F tier for sure. The Golem Fist. Unfortunately, the same issues that plague the KO Cannon plague the Golem Fist. It has a way larger range, but at this point in the game progression, you're mainly fighting fast, flying enemies that make the Golem Fist incredibly difficult to use, especially with its relatively slow fire rate. F tier, unfortunately. The Flairon. Flairon is such a good weapon, but it's a little too slow for the modern day Terraria in-game bosses. The bubbles do home in, but even then they have a pretty slow speed. It definitely isn't bad, and I'd say it's probably the best weapon to use to finish out the game, but I think Flails just have a natural disadvantage that prevents it from going into S and staying right in the A tier. Let's move on to the final category, other weapons. Starting with the Terragram. The Terragram, which is the new version of the Arcalis in pre-hard mode, is obtained out of enchanted shrines, and it is the same weapon. Pretty solid overall. You can use it to get through most bosses in pre-hard mode if you're careful enough. I'm going to throw it in B mainly because it's the only pre-hard mode other melee weapon. The Arcalis. Now the Arcalis is definitely still a pre-hard mode weapon, even though you can now only obtain it in treasure bags as a part of the dev set in hard mode. It just isn't good. I'm sorry to say that. We're going to have to throw it into the F tier. The Shadow Flame Knife. The Shadow Flame knife is just okay. It doesn't do anything absolutely crazy, but it does give you a nice ranged weapon to work with. It can be pretty good when you get the knife bouncing all around multiple enemies. Overall, I'm just going to throw it into the C tier. The Sleepy Octopod. Now the Sleepy Octopod is weird. It swings around in a short range like a sword would almost, but every second or so it charges up. If it hits a block, it causes this little mini explosion. It's decent against large groups of enemies, but overall, I just don't think it's that useful compared to any other weapons around this point. So I'm throwing it down in the F tier. The Scourge of the Corruptor. Now the Scourge of the Corruptor is one of the sleeper hits of the dungeon chest weapons. A lot of people nowadays actually do recognize how good this thing is, but still it is just fantastic. You could probably use this from the moment you get it to the end of the game. Very solid, I'm throwing it in the A tier. The Vampire Knives. These things used to be the cream of the crop, the absolute coolest, most epic melee weapon you could get. Now they aren't that fantastic, but I still really like them, and that life regen boost is very, very good. I'm going to throw them up in the A tier with their corruption counterpart. The Sky Dragon's Fury. The Sky Dragon's Fury is a pretty solid weapon. It has the same issues I have with the Sleepy Octopod, but of course, this one has its right-click ability that launches out spheres of electricity, and that's actually super good, and can even be useful against some of the faster flying bosses as they stay where you fire them. I'm going to put it up into the B tier. The Solar Eruption. Of course, the Solar Eruption is amazing. Like, the Solar Eruptions are both absolutely insane for any melee playthrough, and I can't really say much about this one besides it has to go up in the S tier. The Daybreak. Just like its brother, the Daybreak is a fantastic weapon. Gives you amazing range for the melee class and comes combined with insane amounts of damage. It has to go up in the S tier as well. And this is where the Zenith would go, but it's up in the swords. That's going to wrap up the updated Melee Terraria tier list. The next one will be a massive tier list combining all of the classes into one insane weapons tier list, so stay tuned for that.